The G20 Summit closes in Bali in Indonesia. We'll discuss the key issues and challenges, plus the commitment from all members on climate change. Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu, and this is The Heat. The Indonesian President Joko Widodo officially declared the closing of the G20 Summit before handing over the presidency to the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. The Bali Summit, themed Recovering Together, Recovering Stronger, focused on global health architecture, digital transformation and energy transition. Chinese President Xi Jinping called on G20 members to uphold multilateralism and strengthen international cooperation. We begin our coverage with this report from CGTN's Dongshu in Bali.
Chinese President Xi Jinping held talks again with Indonesian President Joko Widodo. Well, this is the second face-to-face meeting between these two heads of states in 2022 alone. President Xi pointed out that as the representatives of major developing countries as well as emerging markets, China and Indonesia should uphold genuine multilateralism, focus on key areas such as poverty reduction, food security, and financing for development, work to implement highlight projects of the Global Development Initiative, make positive contributions to stronger, green, and to build a closer China-ASEAN community of shared future. Well, President Joko Widodo, on the other hand, extended warm congratulations to President Xi Jinping on his re-election as General Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China and on the full success of the 20th CPC National Congress. Well, Indonesia is satisfied with and grateful for the cooperation between the two sides in the research, development, and production of the COVID-19 vaccines, and is willing to continue to strengthen medical cooperation, as well as the constructions of the Green Industrial Park in the northern part of Indonesia to jointly build a community of shared future between the two countries. And the two heads of state witnessed the signing of the action plan to strengthen the comprehensive strategic partnership, as well as the Belt and Road Cooperation Plan, as well as the cooperation documents on economic and trade cooperation, including that digital economy, vocational education, medical plans, and other fields. Well, President Xi Jinping also met with the UN head Antonio Guterres on the sidelines of the G20 Summit, where Mr. Xi stressed that China will firmly support the international system with the UN as the core. The United Nations firmly support the One China principle, which is an red line must be respected. Mr. Guterres then said UN is ready to continue close cooperation with China. Earlier during the third working session as the discussion on digital transformation, President Xi had also made his remarks, pointing out that the growing scale of the digital economy and the accelerating of a digital transformation across the globe have become important factors affecting the world economic landscape. When hosting the G20 Hangzhou Summit, China included the digital economy in the G20 agenda for the first time and called for finding innovative ways for development and forging new growth drivers. In recent years, the G20 has built more consensus and stepped up cooperation on adapting to digital transformation and building the digital economy. It is hoped that all parties will unleash the dynamism in digital cooperation and bring the benefit of digital economy to the people of all countries. Dongshu from Bali, Indonesia.
For more now on the G20 Summit, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Moscow is Dmitry Babich. He's a journalist and Russian political analyst. Also with us from Philadelphia is Neysun Mahboubi. He's a research scholar with the Center for the Study of Contemporary China at the University of Pennsylvania. Here in Washington, D.C., Sourabh Gupta is a resident senior fellow at the Institute for China-America Studies, and Aina Tangen is a senior fellow at the Tahi Institute in Beijing. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Aina Tangen, let me start with you. The G20 is, of course, one of the bigger international gatherings that takes place every year, apart from the UN General Assembly and other specialized meetings. But at this gathering, President Xi Jinping of China, he reiterated China's support for the international system with the United Nations at its core. He said the international community and regional players should lead by example in promoting the development of all nations. What did you make of the message he made, and how do you think it was received?
Well, quite frankly, it's not a new message. And if you're going to have a multilateral world instead of unipolar, you have to have a mechanism for these countries to come together. I mean, this is now about consensus rather than dictation. And it's very important to affirm that the UN is right now the only major body that brings all countries together and allows them to talk rather than use tanks.
Ina, President Xi also emphasized the growth of the digital economy and digital transformation, saying that China will continue to work with other G20 members to foster what he called a balanced, coordinated and inclusive digital paradigm that will bring benefits to everybody. Explain that to us.
Well, I mean, there's a real concern. Right now, the digital economy is going forward. It's based on intellectual property. The ones who hold it will have the whip hand as they go forward, not only in terms of, the betterment of their societies, but also in terms of the amount of money that's going to be involved. So right now, this is kind of an extension of the Belt and Road Initiative. This is saying to other countries, look, we're not trying to keep the IP here in China. We're trying to grow together. The opportunities that are afforded by a digital economy do not extend to one country. They really multiply with the more countries that are involved, because it's about efficiency. And if you want to create a sustainable world, you need to decrease power, you need to increase efficiency. And this is a very hopeful message, especially for these developing countries, which in the past have been kind of shut out of this land grab for intellectual property, a lot because of education and institutions. China's signaling there's a different way.
Sourabh, Gupta, before the actual G20 summit started, President Xi held a one-on-one meeting, a face-to-face meeting with the United States President Joe Biden. It was described as a positive encounter, which essentially set the tone for the G20. He also met with the leaders for bilateral meetings, a number of leaders, more than half a dozen leaders in Indonesia. What did you make of the summit, and especially that central role that President Xi played with all these one-on-one meetings?
I think it just showed the importance of leader-led, in-person meeting, and how important it is, particularly given what we are coming out of, which is 2.5, 3 years of COVID, when there has not been as much face-to-face meeting, and particularly for the Chinese leader, which has been a setback at some levels for Chinese diplomacy. It was always on the cards that the US and China could stabilize their relationship, given the warm and personable relations that President Xi and President Biden have. But there are also loads of issues in the relationship which have just made it much more complicated, and at times sent it into a spiral. And both parties showed that they are responsible enough to be able to manage their differences and hopefully cooperate in finding solutions. I think some of the other bilaterals were also very important, notably the one with the Australians. This is important because Australia is a party to the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive, the Regional Trade Agreement, and China wants to be part of that, and China wants to anchor its reform, its new round of reform and opening up, including in the area of things like industrial subsidies disciplines, by adhering to CPTPP standards. And it will depend on the Australians and the other parties to bring China in, to allow China to accede. And I think that conversation is important because it sets a ground for China and Australia to begin to thaw their relationship so that they can have economic cooperation going forward. So I think, again, the most important takeaway out here was that in-person leader-level meetings are very important, and we saw that on display in Bali this week.
Sourabh, and one other point, very briefly, if you could, please. Ina Tangen mentioned a moment ago that this was a meeting about consensus. The unipolar world is gone. It no longer exists. It's now a multipolar world. To what extent, how big a change is that?
It is a big change, and it is a highly damaging change. We've had this word like-minded nations creep into our vocabulary a bit too much, and you see a lot of that in the national security strategy and in the communications placed. When the Indonesian foreign minister spoke at the United Nations General Assembly, she alluded to these sort of plurilateral, close-ended groupings actually becoming a factor for dissension. And I think it's very important once again to kind of pluralize it and broaden it out and make it more UN-centered, because we will otherwise willy-nilly work our way, sleepwalk our way into bloc-based formations, which will not be good for the long term.
Neysun Mahboubi, I want to talk a little bit more about that bilateral meeting between President Xi Jinping and President Biden. There were no tangible results, but can you give us a sense of how this relationship has evolved, how the tone has changed, and what it means for the future?
Well, I do think that it's not very easy to identify a tangible result only a couple of days after the meeting, but it was such a warm meeting. There was such a positive dynamic around it that even 2 days later, it does feel like there's a new window for not only the US and China to develop the relationship in a more positive way, but also for China and some of the other countries that are, let's say, allied with or aligned with the US. We saw that President Xi Jinping had very warm meetings as well with the Australian Prime Minister, with many other countries in the region, including Japan, which perhaps have similar concerns that the US does vis-a-vis China. And so I do think there was an overall sort of lifting of a certain kind of a cloud in this meeting that can potentially yield a lot of very tangible benefits in the near future. In terms of your broader question, in terms of where I think this relationship is going between the US and China, perhaps between China and some of these other countries I've mentioned, I do think there's a window now. There's a window of opportunity after this meeting that we will hopefully see a lot of progress. There is certain to be something off in the horizon that will bring back some of the more negative dynamics. That's sort of the nature of, I think, the world order we're in right now and the different kinds of issues between the different countries. But until that happens, it would be great to see as much, as you said, tangible benefit come out of this positive dynamic of this meeting as we possibly can get.
Neysun, as you say, the cloud may have been lifted, but the United States still continues to talk about managing this relationship, which has been interpreted in some quarters as an effort by the United States to contain China's rise. I mean, we have to remember, if we look at United States policy over the last few years, there was the pivot to Asia, which was a policy which was introduced by President Obama. What do you think?
You know, some of these verbal formulations, and there's some that exist on the Chinese side as well, seem to be baked in at this point. And so it may be a little difficult to get out of some of these verbal formulations. And so I prefer to think in very practical, pragmatic terms. Can we find particular areas where the interests of the two sides and of China and other countries as well are sufficiently aligned that we can get something useful done? Again, until that next event off on the horizon, which will make the dynamic a little harder again. And so I prefer to just think about those concrete things, whether they're in the area of environment or health, people-to-people exchange, business. If we can find some of those things to work on in a very pragmatic and practical way, I'm less worried about some of those verbal formulations that exist on both sides.
All right, let's go to Moscow to Dmitry Babich. Dmitry, great to have you with us. The G20 leaders also adopted a declaration at the end of the meeting deploring, I'm using their words, deploring what they termed Russia's aggression in Ukraine in the strongest terms. President Putin was not at this G20 summit. Russia was represented by the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, and for his part, he said that this declaration he condemned it, and he said it was the politicization of the summit. How do you think the Kremlin will see this?
Well, if you look at the full text of the declaration, you will see that there's a phrase there that different opinions were expressed. So maybe, you know, this strongly worded declaration reflects the view of the still powerful G7 group inside the G20. But judging by the statements from the leaders of such countries as China, India, Indonesia itself, we can see that not all major economies of the world share this view of the G7. And I think it's an interesting story, you know, all of these nice words that we have heard just recently from Neysun about the relations, the good relations between China and the United States. Believe me, we heard it also, we Russians heard it for about 20 years after the beginning of Gorbachev's reforms, and then it all turned to dust when geopolitics got involved. And it's an interesting strategy the American diplomats are using. When they talk to the Chinese, they tell them how bad Russia is and how they're all concentrated on containing Russia. When they talk to Russians, which happens very rarely now, they say, oh, no, no, you are not our main enemy. Our main enemy is China. I think, in fact, despite this seemingly nice talk between Xi and Biden, it's clear that the United States did not shirk, did not abandon its ultra-liberal ideology, which views both Russia and China as enemies. And this is directly expressed in some of the declarations that we hear from NATO and from the United States itself, or from such blocs as AUKUS or QUAD, which were created just recently by the United States and which openly say that their aim is to contain China or to limit China's influence, which is basically a nice way to put the same idea of containment. So if you ask me, did this declaration have any effect on public opinion in Russia? I can tell you, it is basically close to zero, because as Americans used to say when they were a lot smarter and more democratic than now, as Americans used to say, all politics is local. Of course, for Russians, what's going on in eastern Ukraine is much more important than some statements that they hear from Bali or from Brussels or from Washington. Basically, the idea that somehow by, making it more difficult for Mr. Lavrov to walk on Bali, saying that he's sick or something, if the West thinks that this is the way to have to create a positive image of the West in Russian public opinion, they're wrong. They're losing the remnants of Russian public opinion that they still have.
All right, Neysun, let me get your opinion very quickly on what Dmitry just told us. That is that an apt comparison that he made when you look at the United States relationship with China? Because he was saying, look, a similar situation existed with Russia, but it actually amounts to nothing.
Well, of course, I don't see it the same way as the colleague from Moscow. I do think that there are some people in the U.S. discourse who sometimes try to lump together Russia and China together, and I think people like myself and others very strongly push back against that, because we see Russia as a power that is declining and looking to the past, whereas China is a power on the rise and looking to the future. So they're very differently situated. China is a country that has benefited from the international world order, that wants to maintain the international world order. And so the interests in that regard, I think, are far more aligned with the United States than with Russia. And lastly, I'll just say that I think it's very hard to argue that Russia has not been diplomatically isolated in the current moment. Of course, President Putin did not go to Bali. Foreign Minister Lavrov, whatever was going on with his health, was not a very active presence, whereas President Xi Jinping was a very active presence. And so he does not seem interested in following Putin down this path of diplomatic isolation. And I think that is what I would take as a very important takeaway point if I was looking at this from Moscow.
Okay, Anna Tangen, as part of that declaration that I was talking about, the French President Emmanuel Macron, he said that G20 leaders agreed to try and persuade Russia to de-escalate the conflict in Ukraine. And to that end, they would also try and get China involved in this, and they want China to play a bigger role in mediation. Now, we know, of course, that China has adopted a neutral position in this conflict. Do you see this going anywhere?
Well, I mean, the meeting between Macron and Xi, the issue came up, and Xi reiterated China's position. They're not very fond of what happened in Ukraine. Obviously, it was against their interests, especially as it pertains to Belt and Road. Ukraine was a major trading partner. These are not things where China was in essence blindsided by the invasion. I know that because I was there on that day, and I was being assured by people who were very high up in the military that nothing was going to happen. This was just saber rattling. So this idea that somehow China is in favor of what Russia's done is nonsense. But the political realities go back to what our Russian colleague has said, and that is the U.S. is trying to divide Russia and China, and China is very concerned about whether or not the U.S. is going to try to use Taiwan in the same way that it used Ukraine. I mean, from Beijing's point of view, the conflict in Ukraine could have been avoided. Everyone in the U.S., from Kennan to Kissinger, said you go into Ukraine with NATO and the EU, and you're asking for conflict. Not it might happen, it will happen. So this idea that it was a surprise, and the same thing is true with Taiwan. And they, if that does happen, China needs a powerful ally, and that would be Russia. You can say that Russia's on the decline and all this kind of stuff, but these are all sovereign nations. There's a certain amount of respect that has to be given to them, and there are security concerns, as the U.S. aptly showed in the 1960s when it threatened to go to nuclear war with Russia over having missiles in Cuba, despite the fact that the U.S. had been putting missiles in Turkey, which are very close to Russia. So, right now it's a bit of a muddle. The real shame here, though, is that the G20 is supposed to solve problems, not attend to the bickerings between countries. It's supposed to be the leadership group, 85% of the world's GDP. They should be out there during this time of crisis, multiple crises, pandemics, economic, ecological. This should be a showcase for how they can lead, coming up with solutions for everybody else. And unfortunately, it was hijacked by both the Russian incident and too much attention on who's meeting who. The issue is, where are the solutions?
Dmitry Babich, there's one other development about Ukraine that I want to get to before we move on to the other issues, and that is the G20 meeting was overshadowed for a brief period by the missile attacks in Poland, which left 2 people dead. Now, the latest information we have had from most sides was that this was a Ukrainian missile. The Ukrainians were using it to try and block incoming Russian missiles. But the media in the United States and the United Kingdom were very quick to say that this was a Russian attack on Poland. And, we've been warned so many times that it could be just a small error, possibly one like this, that could widen the extent of this war very, very quickly. What was the response in Russia?
Well, I speak Polish, and I know that country pretty well. So it was very sad for me last night when I read headlines in the Polish press, and they were just scary, like Russia attacked us, the prime minister held an emergency session of the Security Council, we're going to use Article 5 of NATO, we're going to have our allies protect us. Indeed, it was a very dangerous rhetoric, and it was reassuring, I would say. It's very rare that you hear in Russia praise for the United States now, but when Mr. Biden had the honesty to say that this missile was obviously not from Russia, that it came from Ukraine, we gave him his due. Obviously, the United States is not interested in making this war a global nuclear conflict. Unfortunately, we saw how the Ukrainian president, Zelensky, immediately accused Russia, called on European countries and the United States to punish Russia immediately using all kinds of weapons.
Yeah.
So we saw that it became obvious that Zelensky wants NATO and other Western countries to get involved in the Ukrainian conflict as much as possible. And this is the most dangerous development. The most dangerous development that could happen is basically if NATO, which has 380,000 troops now on the border with Russia, this is 3 times more than the Russian army in Ukraine. If they get involved, that's going to be a tragedy.
Dmitry.
And Poland and Ukraine have been pushing in that direction.
Yeah, I want to move on to Sourabh. Sourabh Gupta, I want to move on to one of the other issues which I talked about right at the beginning of the show in the introduction, and that is the G20 also heard a renewed commitment from leaders and more money. They promised more money to fight climate change. President Xi and President Biden also agreed to resume cooperation on climate change. What is the message that this sends to the world, and particularly to those delegates meeting at COP27?
I think the message, at least that is being sent, is that there is a unified view with regard to, at the leaders level of all the major countries, that this is an imminent global challenge that needs to be tackled. The Bali leaders' declaration talks about the promises which have not been kept in terms of the 100 billion that the rich countries were supposed to provide. But it also talks of that 100 billion being a baseline, and that more money needs to be provided and should be provided, and that discussions should proceed on what that new figure should be. The climate change section was a long section. I think the climate change section was actually the second section, immediately in the leaders' declaration, after they talked a little bit about Ukraine, or just the initial paragraphs. It jumped straight into food insecurity issues, and after that, the climate change issue was front and center. So I think it's a positive message. It's even more positive that China has put out its global methane plan, that Kerry and the Chinese negotiator met in Sharm el-Sheikh, and that countries are once again talking and hoping to find solutions. Easy solutions are not going to be found, but at least people are moving in the right direction, and that's as much as we can ask for at this point of time.
Neysun Mahboubi, very quickly, I've only got 20 seconds for a really big question, and that is the G20 really still relevant today? Because there are some who say that, look, it was created after the financial crisis to basically contain emerging countries like China.
That may be a question that's above my pay grade, but I will say that whatever the origins of the G20, when you see countries like China, India, playing such a major role, the next presidency, of course, is going to India. It may be evolving as an institution beyond its origins, and may have this productive role to play, as we see that this dynamic this year was quite productive.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu. Thanks for watching.